Hello everyone from the Documentale in Berlin. My name is Davide Batici and I will be your moderator tonight. I am a PhD student in neuroscience at the Max Delbrück Center here in Berlin. And tonight I'm very happy to welcome here Dr. Edna Bonhomme. Edna is an historian of science, journalist and critical and cultural critic whose work explores the intersection of medicine, history, politics, and social inequalities. She holds a PhD in the history of science from Princeton University after studying at Columbia University and Reed College, and her writing has appeared in publications including The Guardian, The Nation, and Al Jazeera. She has held research fellowships at institutions like the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science here in Berlin, and tonight we'll be discussing her book, The History of the World in Six Plagues, which examines how epidemics from cholera to COVID-19 have shaped societies and exposed deep inequalities around class, race, power, and access to care. I'll now hand it over to Edna, who will read us a first excerpt from her book.
Before I begin, I want to thank you for moderating this conversation and for all of you who are attending, as well as the organizers and care workers who made this possible. So I will read a chapter, or part of a chapter, that discusses an outbreak that happened in a prison. For Haitians who insist on being heard in their own words, uploading a video through social media can generate an electric viral response. One reminder of the power of these digital narratives came from a video uploaded to Facebook in June of 2022. As the camera moves through a poorly lit and overcrowded room, several men begin to emerge in the background. A voice, which appears to be that of a cameraman, is speaking Haitian Creole outside the frame. There it is. You see that? Here's the water. Look at its color. He continues to describe the scene, the meager food, the dirty floor, and the broken windows. And here, another speaker interjects to state, they don't give us anything. They have no mattresses, the boxes to sleep on, and as the video continues to pan around the space, there are 19 men in the facility lying on the floor, surrounded by fraying plastic bags. Pointing to the concrete ceiling where shards of dirty white paint peel away, the narrator says, if there's an earthquake, this is where we will die. This is where there's no toilet and the men have a hole in the ground to relieve themselves. Near the end of the clip, someone enters and tells the videographer to calm down. The man retorts, I can't calm down because I am suffering. At this point, the camera halts. Russian literature isn't something I think about very much every day, but in the fall of 2022, during a period when discourse and public health measures concerning COVID began to wane, infectious outbreaks were still prevalent in prisons. When I received a flurry of videos from the Haitian prison, I was reminded of Leo Tolstoy's novel, Resurrection. All these institutions seemed purposely invented for the production of depravity and vice, condensed to such a degree that no other conditions could produce it, and for the spread of this condensed depravity and vice broadcast among the whole populations. End quote. Haiti is the 21st century castaway among and removed from the 19th century Russia, but one similarity was very evident. Prisons are more concerned with depriving people of their humanity than solving social problems. The video from the National Penitentiary was posted in June of 2022 by Theriel Delius, and it was not just the content that disturbed me, but the conditions that led to the men's incarceration in the first place. Although the Haitian Ministry of Justice has a responsibility to provide prisoners with details of their arraignment and trial, these men, like 81% of the incarcerated people in Haiti, had yet to be charged with a crime. According to the United Nations Human Rights Council, Haiti routinely sees the illegal and arbitrary uses of pretrial detention, and in some cases, people remain incarcerated because they could not afford to pay for their release. During that time, the Haitian prison was only suitable for 2,000 people, and yet 11,000 were incarcerated. What does it mean to defend the dead? Christina Sharp once wrote, to tend to the black and to tend to the dying. What does it mean to always be living on the edge? What does it mean to work? On January 12, 2010, Haiti was hit by a huge earthquake, which killed over 250,000 people and left over 1 million people homeless. That summer, I decided on a whim to move to Port-au-Prince with relief efforts, and as a result of my graduate program at Columbia, I was able to experience and also have some expertise to help. But the situation was grave when I arrived, and amid the endemic poverty and political instability, there was also a remaining problem with infrastructure. The people of Haiti were struggling to rebuild their lives. Things got significantly worse a few months later when a new killer emerged on the scene, and that was cholera. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So one of the central arguments in the book, as we heard, is that diseases are biological entities, or caused by biological entities, but the scale of their devastation actually is often shaped by social and political decisions. So what first led you to approach the history of epidemics from this perspective?
Thank you for that question. And I think that anyone who's ever written about health, epidemics, and science in general is often looking to and reading about the various atrocities in the world on the one hand, but also thinking about, very basic questions. What makes people sick? Why are certain diseases reemerging, especially if we've been able to develop scientific and medical advancement to help either prevent certain outbreaks from occurring and or even treating diseases. And so for me, I was always curious about nature, about science. In fact, I even studied biology, but I also wanted to understand what was the relationship between the microbes that I could see under a microscope versus the reality of people's lived experience of having to encounter an outbreak happening in real time. The chapter that I just read an excerpt from focused on a very recent outbreak, a smaller one that went unrecognized by most people in the world for a host of reasons, because at the time we were dealing with COVID, this is 2022, but it was the return of a cholera outbreak, specifically in a space of confinement amongst people who were probably one of the most marginalized, not just within the Caribbean and Haiti, but also people who were incarcerated in a prison that was overcrowded. And part of what I wanted to capture, not just from that specific reporting and contact with people who were incarcerated, was what was the disease like and what would it have meant to be able to cope with this outbreak in real time, but also how they were trying to understand and record it so that there could be a historical record. So for me, what I was fascinated by was the documentation that was occurring by people who were incarcerated. And for one of the things that I asked was, well, how did you have a phone to begin with to record this? And the conditions of incarceration are slightly different there than perhaps in the US or even in Germany, where sometimes people could have things like a cell phone or depending on if their family members brought it. And so as a historian, as someone who was trained in history, working in the archives, also thought that it was important to think about these alternative histories that aren't just about quote unquote great men, just the scientists, but also everyday people who are also trying to figure out ways to tell their own stories and provide some kind of release, reprieve from the traumas, in some cases suffering that they encounter. Science, I think, is such an important topic for us to study, mostly because it's the thing that makes us. We are organisms, and we are, and as Ed Yong's book has said, we also contain multitudes. So doing the diligent work of looking both on a molecular level as well as on a social level can help us be able to ensure that people lead healthy and happy lives as they deserve.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and if I can, tag along, the actual purpose of science is people themselves. So we have to keep this in mind. As a researcher myself, sometimes I forget because I focus on my research and I don't see the patient behind the goals of what I'm doing every day, but it's absolutely important and crucial to keep this in mind. Captivity, as we heard, is also a big theme throughout the whole of your book. You now mention cholera in Haiti in 2022, and this traces back also to the beginning of your book, to the first chapter where you also talk about cholera in the plantations in the United States during the 19th century. So how you describe captivity as a potential further trigger for division and inequality, rather than actually a measure to control disease spreading. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, so in the book, I think about captivity both as a kind of metaphor for every part of our life, but also for something that some of us can choose and some of us don't necessarily. So each of the chapters, the first one looking at cholera outbreaks that happened on plantations in the US American South. The other chapters look at sleeping sickness in a concentration camp, medical concentration camp in East Africa. And then I continue with other basically case studies that hone in on microhistories that I had never really fully understood when I was being trained as a biologist, as a public health practitioner, or even as a historian. What I wanted to do, particularly with the cholera chapter, is to think about a disease that had actually caused havoc throughout the world in the 19th century. There were cholera outbreaks pretty much every decade happening everywhere from Russia, Europe, New York City, Latin America. And most of the histories about cholera outbreaks in the 19th century focus on cities. And one of the most infamous accounts of it is the city of London, where John Snow, as a public health practitioner and microbiologist, was able to track down the source of a cholera outbreak to a pump on Broad Street. In fact, even till today, if you go on Broad Street, you'll see a marker indicating where that happened. And being the curious person that I am, and being someone who, yes, I want to understand those bigger histories of triumph, of success, of exchange, I also wanted to understand, well, I'm sure that cholera also impacted people outside of cities. And so then I had to do the diligent work of going to the archives to see who had written about this before. And there had been several people, like a colleague or former colleague, Christina Fryer, who looked at cholera outbreaks in plantations in Jamaica. And so that is an excellent source for people who are interested. Charles Rosenberg, who was a historian of science at the University of Pennsylvania, also looked at some cases of cholera outbreaks in some parts of the western US and eastern parts of the US. And so what I did is I went directly to plantation manuals, which were and continue to exist as archival documents of enslaved people who were forced to be on plantations, black people that is, and what happened to them, what their names was in some cases, their ages, if they got sick, if they died, if they were sold. I also looked at medical manuals, I looked at speeches, I looked at the records of people who had been formerly enslaved, who learned to read and write, such as Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, and I read their autobiographies and tried to understand how they also saw disease outbreaks that were occurring, or even just who got sick and who healed others on the plantation as black people amongst themselves. And all of that was quite illuminating for me to be able to then think, okay, there were outbreaks, there were small moments in which people did get cholera, depending on the plantation. It didn't look the same way that cholera outbreaks occurred in, for example, New York City at the same time during the 1830s or 50s, but they existed, and part of the role of a historian or any scholar who wants to write about these very micro histories that aren't so clear-cut is to be able to use a wider range of sources and to use sources from people who may not have been traditionally sought after as a reliable source. And this similarly relates to the cholera outbreaks in the Haitian prison, where it's not just looking at for me, looking at the data from the Haitian government or the UN, which is also important to be able to understand the number of deaths that occurred, but it's also, in my case, to think about, okay, the people who might have been sick, did they document this through song, through videos in the modern context, by writing their own autobiography, through photographs? Are there accounts of them in the newspaper, or, and I don't know if I wrote it in this book, but definitely in others, by the 1930s in the US, there was a whole project during the time of the Great Depression to record the histories of some of the last living enslaved people. And in some cases, those oral testimonies could also be used as a way to triangulate the very rich and complex history of what it meant to live on a plantation, or what it meant to experience any kind of medical hiccup on a plantation in the US context. And so I think for me in that chapter, as well as the other chapters, I tried to reference, find as many sources as I could to be able to have an honest and integral history of the past.
Absolutely, you did an incredible literature research, and I'm thinking, like, connecting to this, I'm also thinking, how rare was it to find written manuscripts from direct testimonies, or like that's direct testimony of people who lived, for example, like you were mentioning Harriet Jacobs, who lived on their skin, slavery. I bet now, of course, is what, as you were saying, like we all are equipped with a telephone or a mobile phone with which we can have videos and so, but like not back then, of course, it was really something that was not something not possible, not even like access to education and literacy was something rare. So how deep did you have to dive to find these actual testimonies?
So in the US context, surprisingly, even though a majority of enslaved Black people were not given the opportunity to learn how to read or write, in fact, in some states it was considered illegal, there were people who either they escaped slavery or they were manumitted because the person who owned them or enslaved them set them free, or in some cases they were educated while still being enslaved, that it was still possible. And even in the 1700s, late 1700s, people like Phyllis Wheatley, who is an African-American woman who had been enslaved, who had been educated and is considered a celebrated poet in the US American context. And that, it's rare for her to have done that in the late 1700s as a formerly enslaved person who is woman, but it did happen. By the 1850s and 60s, which is the time that I focused on with thinking about the cholera outbreaks on plantations, there was a larger number of people of African descent in the US who had become free. And some of them were living in the North, some of them had relatives who had escaped to Canada and come back. Someone like, for example, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the first African-American to get a PhD from Harvard, and had also studied here in Berlin, very briefly, at what is now the Humboldt University. He was at least the second, if not third generation of a free Black person. And he was born in Massachusetts in the North. And there are plenty of educated Black Americans before the liberation of, or before the abolition of slavery, that had been living free lives, mostly in the North though, and many of them wrote. And then there are people like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs in particular, who had been enslaved and who had to learn how to read, but once they did it, they documented their lives and no one could stop them. But then there were other people, more specifically, someone who some of you might know, Harriet Tubman. She never learned how to read and write or Sojourner Truth. And so the divide between those who were literate and weren't was quite great. But even those who weren't able to read and write or to write their own stories, they gave speeches. Sojourner Truth gave speeches, and that is how she was able to provide her own testimonies about enslavement. And then I think there's something else to be said too, is that, you know, just because a person isn't always able to document their histories or their narrative or their autobiography doesn't mean it's not worth figuring out who they were. And this is where Saidiya Hartman's work, she's a scholar based in the US who coined the term critical fabulations, really tries to dig deep to think about those complex histories of those who weren't able to leave that written record. And if people haven't read, I would highly recommend Lose Your Mother by Saidiya Hartman, as well as Scenes of Subjection, where she thinks about transatlantic slave trade. She thinks about what is lost in the archive and also the political weight that the archive carries, precisely because there's a hierarchy of which narratives are considered important and which are not. So I think it's an excellent question of, like, how does one even find these, and how many people can read and write in a certain period of, you know, absolute torture and forced labor. But I think that that's where we owe it to ourselves to be creative in our approaches in digging into the archives and digging into these kernels of thought.
Absolutely, fantastic. And now I'm really curious to hear more from your book, if you will.
Okay. So I'm gonna turn to German history a bit, but not quite. So this is from the chapter that focuses on Robert Koch and his time in East Africa. So, as early as 10 years of age, well before I moved to Germany in 2017, I was taught about the trains that transported Jewish families from their homes to the Nazi regime's ghastly death camps. And later, I would learn that people who were branded with the pink triangle, an emblem for queer people, were also massacred. I learned about these abuses of power and degradation of human dignity through a wellspring of sources: my history textbooks, popular films, and more tacitly, museums. These accounts passed on in the United States were a critical reminder of the cruelty of men, reminders of a history affirmed by countless scholars in hopes that it should never be repeated. Those lessons, however, never extended to the medical concentration camps established in Africa, at least not until I moved to Germany. When most people think about concentration camps, the term immediately evokes Nazi extermination camp. But the practice and technology is older and far wider reaching than what I had ever known. As early as 1899, during the early part of the Anglo-Boer War, which occurred between 1899 and 1902 in present-day South Africa, the British government established concentration camps to target Boer or European settlers and anti-colonial Africans. Tens of thousands of Boers and Africans died in the overcrowded and unhygienic camps for malnutrition, dysentery, typhoid fever, and more. And between 1904 and 1908, the German Empire used a similar military tactic against the Herero and Nama descendants. And in this case, several thousand women, children, and men were placed in these concentration camps, leading to a genocide of these two African ethnic groups. For civilians and rebels that interfered with colonial expansion, African concentration camps became a swift and cruel method to eliminate insurgents. To be clear, these political camps that were installed in German Southwest Africa were gravely different from those in Europe, but it's important to understand that the seminal influence of science developed on unwilling, if not enslaved, Africans in the earliest days of modern medicine need to be understood. The science was developed without the care for well-being, without acknowledgement of its test subjects' suffering, and with no repair for the work and its results. Undoubtedly, blood extracted from the sick, sourced straight from the blood and the bodies of colonized Africans. Even Koch observes that some of his patients at one of his East African medical concentration camps were not interested in the business of being held captive. Devoid of rancor and speaking of patients held in medical camps near Lake Victoria, he wrote, quote, "As soon as they feel better or the cure becomes long and tedious, they break it off and run away. Many of our patients who had come from abroad also had to stop early because they could no longer leave their property unattended or ran out of money to support themselves," end quote. The statement reveals that even when some Africans initially yearned to seek treatment, the drugs and detention meant that many of them could and wanted to escape. Reading this in the archives, I was astounded by Koch's honesty, easily distinguishable from the remainder of the text, a localized scientific report about colonial East Africa.
It's chilling. So Robert Koch, winner, 1905 Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine, complex figure for sure. Why is it important, in your opinion, to revisit these kind of historical characters nowadays?
Yeah, so like you, because you're a scientist and you're still practicing, unlike me, who just fell off the horse, Robert Koch was and is still considered an important figure for those of you, or those of us who've studied microbiology, because of his role in establishing germ theory, because of his role in also looking at and studying cholera and other diseases as well, hence the reason he was awarded the Nobel Prize. And he also was someone who was an international scientist and an international superstar, and invited to travel to various non-European countries to establish and think deeply about the various outbreaks that were occurring. So malaria and cholera, of course, but also in this case where I look at sleeping sickness. And part of what I wanted to do was to think about the other side of Robert Koch, not the figure that was celebrated, not the one who is, in this case, in the German context, we have an institute named after him, a public health institute, but someone who, by today's standards, would be held with caution and skepticism, precisely because of the question around bodily autonomy, consent, and the ethical role that a person should have when conducting research with human subjects seemed to be absent in the work that he was doing. One could say, actually, well, he wasn't that different than many of his colleagues at the time, more specifically, many of his European colleagues, and the ways in which they conducted scientific research on the African continent. And just because something was common back then doesn't necessarily make it right. And so this is, something I'm trying to work through in the chapter, is like, who was Robert Koch, the scientific figure who made these advancements that is actually quite admirable? Who is Robert Koch, the international traveler who also found himself researching, trying to understand, and also trying to solve these basically medical mysteries that were occurring in the various locales that he was sent to? But then also, who is this person who, leaving these notes behind, his medical and scientific notes, while he was on the ground trying to understand and address the outbreaks that were occurring, not just in East Africa, but elsewhere? How did he see himself and what he was doing, and to what extent did he afford humanity to the subjects, the patients that he encountered on the African continent? What I at least tried to do in the chapter was to also think about the legacy and the reception. And so interviewing people who are Germans who live here, work here, a couple scientists, a researcher, and even a student, or someone who was a student activist at the time, to also get a sense of how people are not just thinking about Robert Koch, but how people are thinking about German history and the various histories that we're told, and how we can work through the not just the atrocities that happened on German land, but how the German Empire extended certain forms of violence elsewhere. And this I am not German. In fact, although I'm not German, I have a German child. But I think that now that I have a German child, I do think it's important for me to get a deeper, richer perspective on the history in the way that I try to handle in the book, but also in how I have active, honest, and ethical conversations about what we've done to people throughout histories and throughout the world.
Absolutely. I'm also not German myself, but I think it just boils down to a Western approach, really, on patronizing approach over Africans at the time, or in general over colonies, just an imperialistic mindset. And this is something that we actually we don't need to go back to Koch to find examples of this. In 1996, Pfizer basically conducted an open-air laboratory experiment in Nigeria where they tested an antibiotic on kids. Some of them died. They settled for breadcrumbs, basically 75 million was given partly to the families, partly to finance the hospital, like building of hospitals in Nigeria. So this is, in general, a problem that we're still living with. What do you think the actual responsible of this problem is? It's like us as a society, us Westerners, as a society, governments, something deeper, something within humankind, or Westerners at least?
I think the first thing we have to do, and I guess my history is a bit complicated. Like I was born and bred in the West, but I'm also marked by a particular history that comes with dispossession and displacement. And so that comes with both privilege and pain, and I recognize that I can move in and out of privilege depending on where I am, but also that marginality also exists. Nevertheless, I do think what you're raising is quite important, which is what is to be done by those of us who benefit from the fruits of capitalism, from the extraction that is ongoing, from unethical medical experiments in some cases that have occurred without recompense, and how do we actually recognize those things and then create some type of plan to make a repair. And I think that there aren't a lot of good examples of how repair has happened, and I mean honest repair, because in a sense, guilt or shame doesn't solve the problem. Maybe it's the first step for some people to at least then to acknowledge, but acknowledgement in itself, or even a rhetorical apology, isn't enough. I think that we owe it to each other to be more diligent about redistributing resources, about redistributing aid without it coming with this the kind of weight of charity, and to also just if we can send people to the moon and they can circle and have a good time and come back safely, which is great. If they can,
or invest 5% of the GDP on
on wars and so forth, we should at least try to figure out how we can make amends for the past, and how we can also do better by those who are living with us today. And I think that there are small examples of that. I think, for example, and this is a smaller scale. So in the 90s, when I was growing up as a child in the US, one of the most destructive hurricanes passed through South Florida and Miami, where I was living. And it was called Hurricane Andrew, and it was quite destructive in that we didn't have electricity for 2 weeks. The water tables were polluted, and people were having to figure out, in some cases, their homes destroyed, how to survive. And it was at that very tender age of 7, 8 that I saw that when crisis occurs, people come together and people are inherently good. And I know that's maybe some people might not feel that way right now in this current political moment, but in seeing that at a young age, adults helping each other, providing for their neighbors, cooking for each other, boiling water, etc., I knew that if that could be possible after a catastrophe, it should be possible today in normal times. And so I try to hold on to the younger version of myself who was, and I hope is continuing to be optimistic. And I hope that we can carry that through, not just in how we organize ourselves politically, but more specifically in medicine and science, which has become so politicized and polarizing in this moment. And even if people don't read my book, which obviously my publisher would say, please buy my book, but you don't have to. I hope
you should, though.
I hope that people can read other science writing, whether it's short form, long form, or books like by Ed Young, who's one of my favorites, so that you're able to see, oh wow, there's so much that we already know. How do we apply it, and how do we do so in a more just and fair way?
Absolutely, the community building, and education. So this leads me to another aspect that also comes in your book, which I already discussed, education. There's an example, again, that brings these two aspects together. Example from a book that brings these two aspects together. So education and community building, coming from, again, prisons. Women prison in New York State during the 80s, 90s outbreak of AIDS. Women got together and decided to take care of themselves and to also, introduce each other to what was going on around them and take care of each other. So, really interesting. Can you tell us more maybe about this example?
Yeah, so one of the chapters which I wanted to write, even before I wrote the book, I was like, I have to write about HIV/AIDS as a disease, as a disease and a condition that has basically been around that in a way that we don't before I was born. But yet has also been part of my consciousness for various reasons. It's been part of my consciousness because the ways in which the, ethnic group that I'm part of has been historically scapegoated for it back in the 80s and early 90s. And then also it's been in my consciousness as someone who was reading about it through my public health education and thinking about when we were studying public health, like when I was studying public health, HIV/AIDS was a case study of an outbreak, and that was hard to manage in the beginning. It was there was a lot of miseducation, poor political planning, a lot of activism that was tied to it. There were artists who I had kind of grown up knowing about, people like David Bonhomme, Julie Holtz, and Felix Gonzalez-Torres, who had died from HIV/AIDS, as well as people who weren't just visual artists, but writers, dancers, Alvin Ailey, that I kind of knew about, or because I was growing up in a very culturally rich environment, had realized that there was a whole generation that had been lost from this disease in the US context, in the cities that I consider home, New York City and Miami, that I wanted to understand who else was being impacted by HIV/AIDS in a manner that wasn't quite how I had grown up thinking about it, how I was trained during my public health education to also study the disease. So I did the work of just reading through materials, and I had known about this group called ACT UP, which was an activism group that was mostly had began in New York City, of people who had tested positive for HIV/AIDS and their allies, who wanted the US government in the late 80s to do something more to not only recognize the disease, but to support the science to be able to, so that people could know and find a cure. And there was a parallel version or to ACT UP that existed in a prison, and that parallel version was called ACE, which is the AIDS Counseling and Education Program, and it was in a women's prison in upstate New York. And so in this women's prison, which slowly but surely I started to read about this group and the people who were involved in it, I came to see that they organized together to be able to support the HIV positive women who had been incarcerated. They formed, support groups. Some of them got post-university degrees. Some of them wrote peer-reviewed articles from prison. Some of them wrote poetry. They created plays and performed them in the prison itself. And I was very inspired by such rich and also just provocative ways of coming together in a space in which they were told to shrink themselves. They were told that they should only be punished and that there ultimately would be no form of repair or rehabilitation. But I also noticed when going through the archives and reading their testimonies, reading the book, one of the books they published collectively, is that some of these women who had been incarcerated before they were in prison had also been activists. Like several of them had been part of the Weather Underground, which was a far left group. Some of them had just been raised poor. Like they had just been raised poor, and by virtue of being raised poor in the U.S. and Black and Latina, like you just find yourself sometimes imprisoned. And seeing and reading and about their lives was quite inspiring, but it also gave me a chance to see and understand HIV/AIDS, not just from this biological perspective that I had been taught, which was, okay, certain groups are more susceptible to disease, and so certain groups are vectors of disease, and how do we minimize this? And there was a point when I was living in New York City and getting my training, I was also interviewing people who were or potentially HIV positive, and as well as testing people. And so reading through the archives gravely contrasted with the experience I had of doing the research on the ground. But I think that reading the stories and also the accounts gave me a human dimension that the on the ground research didn't allow, because I saw the women at Bedford Hills Prison as more than vectors of disease. I saw them as people who took agency over their lives in this collective fashion, and in a way that people would not have expected them to, by virtue of the fact that they were incarcerated, they were women, they had been told that they had done something wrong to society and that they shouldn't really appreciate the lives that they had. And that chapter is really, I would say, a love letter to people who get discarded or who might feel discarded, and to know that there's other ways and other possibilities, even if we're put to the side.
Yeah. Great, really. I would now like to extend the conversation to the public. Is there any question coming from the audience? Does not.
I promise I won't bite, because there's a stage that separates us.
There is one there. Okay.
Thank you, Edna. Great work. My question is about the present outbreak, and you do write about Ebola. So if you had to rewrite your book, taking in light what is happening with the present Ebola outbreak, what will you add?
I think that's a great question. And one thing I would say is, my book was published in March of 2025, and there was an outbreak of Ebola last year in 2025. And at the time, I did write a short article about that outbreak I think it was in the London Review of Books, where that outbreak in the beginning, the first quarter of 2025, there had actually been a coordinated effort by the African CDC to not only figure out ways to track and diagnose people who had contracted Ebola, but to do the work vis-a-vis Ugandan universities that had been training scholars and researchers to track and treat and contain the virus. And in addition to that, at the time, they had also been thinking about developing a vaccine for Ebola and had carried out some trials at the time. fast forward to 1 year later, we're in 2026, and another outbreak has emerged, and it feels as if some of the gains that had been made a year ago are suddenly receding. I think one of the things that is important to note in the context of the current 2026 outbreak is the political moment we're in. And the political moment we're in is one in which there's been a divestment of funds from things like the USAID, which provided supplementary funding for many health programs in the Global South. There's also just, I guess one could say, the political chaos and exhaustion of the current administration in the US, which is also fueled by anti-science rhetoric. And there's also just, the disease is also changing. And the exhaustion that happens from trying to address it a year ago coming back is also going to cause a setback of sorts. At the same time, there have been heaps of gains made by the African CDC, by African scientists on the ground, and I can't predict the future, unfortunately. This is not something I was trained in, sadly, but I hope that with the resources that are currently on the ground, and with the knowledge that they used last year, like with the previous Ebola outbreak that happened in 2025 and being able to address it, that hopefully that can also be applied today. I thought you were going to ask about hantavirus, which I did recently write about for Al Jazeera, which, this is a live outbreak as well, which has a different trajectory, like a disease that has been endemic, or people consider it to be endemic, in certain parts of South America and also Central America and Panama, and with small traces in the Caribbean. And now it's traveling, and the Andes variant, which is the most likely to have the human-to-human transmission, is what we're worried about, or what scientists are worried about, because if it escapes from the kind of quarantine pockets that have been established, it could pose a problem, mostly because, as it stands, because I interviewed a scientist last week about it, mortality for those who are infected could be about 30 to 40% for the Andes variant, not for, because there's many hantaviruses, just for the record. And so this is something that that scientists, public health officials are also following. And I guess this is the thing that, not just with my book, but with people who are doing health and science reporting in journalism, or historians of medicine and science, is that there are various pockets of outbreaks that are constantly happening in local contexts. And this is why, science education is important. We need to democratize this so that as many people as possible understand the basics, if not more. And that that we have reporters who are paid and on the ground asking questions, talking to scientists, and that also scientists like yourself are also able to have those conversations with a public so that people can understand how an outbreak operates and the specificities of a disease in a local context. But yeah, Ebola, I'm following it. I haven't written about the 2026 version, but maybe I will, so stay tuned.
Thank you. Thank you for the great talk. We all have experienced the COVID as a pandemic, as one of the plagues, and I would love to know if it was the trigger of this book to come out with this history, and especially because we have experienced it as a global issue. And I would love to know as well if in the book there is mention of other parts of especially Asia, because it's about the history of the world. I noticed that you talk a lot about America, Latin America, Europe, Africa, and I know that also Asia, demographically, it's also very important. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. And one thing I would say is that regarding the inspiration for the book, In a sense, it's the childlike version of myself that was always interested in science. And for someone, like when I was 13, I went back and looked at my journal from the time that I was 13, and I had 10 things I wanted to do. And one of them was to get a Nobel Prize, I don't know. Another was to figure out the grand unified theory. For those of you who ever studied physics, you understand exactly what I'm talking about. And another was just to get a PhD from MIT. Sadly, I didn't do that. Instead, I just got it from Princeton. So that 13-year-old person, I failed her. But what I would say is that I was always interested in thinking about plagues and diseases, and at every stage, whether it was my biology, like my undergraduate degree, which was in biology, I was in a lab, pipetting, working late at night, trying to understand what was happening with, more specifically, multiple sclerosis and muscular dystrophy, and how we could treat it vis-a-vis the lab that I was working in. And by the time that I did my master's, and then I was mostly focusing on HIV/AIDS, and the PhD was all plague, but it was looking at and thinking about plague within the context of the history of North Africa. I think that this book, in a sense, felt like I was graduating from these regional areas where I always thought about disease from a local context, whether it's like, okay, this specific disease, muscular dystrophy and multiple sclerosis, that's isolated in animal, human subjects, and then HIV/AIDS in the Caribbean and New York City. And then I wanted to think about the world. I wanted to think about how these micro studies, these micro cases, could also help inform us about, COVID, and that is in the chapter, or that is in the book, and there's a chapter on it. But beyond that, like, what triggers us to respond to outbreaks in the ways that we do? What leads certain groups of people to really go down this road of extreme skepticism and doubt and losing their trust in science and political officials, which I talk a little bit about in this book. But also what makes people, curl up and just like want to avoid all contact altogether, and the potential trauma responses that emerge. All of that is kind of inspiring me or helping me think through these questions. Unfortunately, I did not include a chapter on the Asian continent, mostly because I didn't feel equipped enough to go through the kind of linguistic archives of many of the, if I think about like East Asian languages, which are rich. And if we think about the history of Chinese medicine, it goes far beyond the history of the United States or Germany, and it can speak to and offer us a lot of guidance about the different plagues that happened in the Asian context. So that is one subject, one area that I could or someone else could write about in another context, but I didn't include it in the book. So the thing I did contemplate about, and I think is important, especially in the COVID context, is how in the US, as well as here in Germany, there was a scapegoating of people of Asian descent, and what damage that did for those who had that background, and how we shouldn't, like, the people who did that shouldn't have done that, and how, in the future, when people are being scapegoated, it's up to those of us who don't harbor those discriminations and prejudices to stand up for and defend people who are being targeted with that kind of rhetoric. But I very much welcome people to, if they don't read this book, to read other books that are doing the diligent archival work of unpacking science and science histories so that we could all be better informed.
Absolutely. Other question?
Thank you for your insight. It's very engaging and inspiring. And I would be interested in the question, what insights can we gain from your angle of research for concepts of global pandemic preparedness?
So one thing I would say is that for those who are novices in reading science literature or even science journalism, that there's excellent reporting being done by Catherine Wu at the Atlantic magazine. There's excellent work by Toni at the Scientific American. At the New York Times, Apurva Manawarova, she does excellent work, and I think that, and I'm mentioning these as entry points because as science journalists who communicate about contemporary, research, peer-reviewed research that is being published, they also have access to practicing scientists who are doing the work, and they are able to articulate in plain language what is happening. And dovetailed with that, I would say that is also important, and maybe I do this because I'm a nerd, to read, the World Health Reports that are published. The Robert Koch Institute does publish reports about what's happening, recommendations, even just what, I have a child, so vaccination recommendations, things of that nature. And I think that the kind of regular, consistent form of reading on these topics, whether it's through the media that is vetted, as well as the official health organizations that have researchers on their team to also provide recommendations and suggestions, that those can be a great foundation so that once one also wants to read an entire book, if one wants to, that it can help to then guide a person into that work. And beyond that, I think that one area of work that goes under-recognized in the, maybe by some people today because social media is so prevalent, is I loved watching the Discovery Channel and PBS specials of the Blue Planet and so forth, where they actually are visually stunning and allow people to understand and think about the natural world and
everything that has David Attenborough's voice, for example.
It's just lovely to see, and in fact, this is what inspired me. So when I was in 13, I was in marine biology summer camp every summer, for a couple years, and we would, for 8 weeks, just go snorkeling in Miami, or not Miami proper, but we would go off the coast, get on a boat, and just see the coral reefs, and that experience of just being out in the sea, in the ocean, and seeing how the importance of nature is, that in itself was the thing that helped to also fuel my interest in science and to understand its importance, because then, we have to protect, I felt like I had to contribute to the protection of these spaces by virtue of it being so beautiful and accessible to me.
If I can add something, the number one key, or what I normally focus my lectures on, is reference. When an article provides references that are normally connected to high-level journals, scientific journals, then you need to trust, because we're literally flooded by media that was just predatorily trying to have clicks and views. So references are key, I would say. Other questions? There's one in the bottom.
I'm going to go back to something you guys, or that you mentioned earlier about your younger self, how after the hurricane, you saw a bunch of unity occur in your community. And I think generally throughout the world, in places where people are struggling, we see that unity. And in a day and age where it's everything seems so polarizing and divisive, where do you think we can find that unity when people aren't necessarily going through strife?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I think that it's an important question, because one could say that there is not only a loneliness epidemic happening amongst a certain segment of people, there's also a lot of alienation and isolation that can exist in the context of the political fragmentation that has kind of surfaced. And I think some of that has connections to the rise of like social media, also further distancing people from those like intimate human connections that are face to face. Nevertheless, I would say that if people can, like, just being in the same room can help. Reading a book can help. I have a dumb phone that that makes it so that I don't look at social media so much, and I can just like be in the world and just daydream. And I think having that chance and having those opportunities can help us have the unity that you speak of. Thank you.
We unfortunately need to close the streaming, but the conversation here on site can continue. Thank you again, Edna, for this fantastic chat. And join me in an applause to her, please. All right.